morning, everybody, and welcome to today's A.P.E.X. event. My name is Dr. Matt Wegg, and I am the Director of the Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Joshua Eyler. Dr. Eyler comes to us from the University of Mississippi, where he is the Director of Faculty Development in the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, Director of the Think Forward Quality Enhancement Plan, an initiative that fosters critical thinking in Ole Miss students, and a faculty member in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. Josh earned his PhD in Medieval Studies from the University of Connecticut in 2006, and after earning tenure in the English department at Columbus State University, he shifted his focus from teaching students to helping faculty become better teachers. Prior to his current position, he directed teaching centers at George Mason University and Rice University. In 2018, he published How Humans Learn: The Science and Stories Behind Effective College Teaching, which is a must-read for all college instructors. He's a highly sought-after speaker, and I couldn't be more excited to have him here at SUU. Please join me in welcoming Josh Eyler.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. Well, thank you for that great introduction. I appreciate it. It's really exciting to be here. I want to just first thank Lynn for setting all this up. I don't think that I've ever had a green room before, which is really super exciting. We medievalists are not used to that kind of treatment. I also want to thank. I had the opportunity to speak to be a guest in 2 educational psychology classes yesterday, and I want to thank those who set that up. But I also talking with the students in those classes yesterday gave me great hope for the future of education. So that was wonderful. Okay, so our mission today is to try and help this poor fellow who looks like he needs some help. Before we get there, I just want to fill in a little bit about my background. I am at the University of Mississippi. I've only been there for a few months. I just moved in the summer. Prior to that, I was at Rice and George Mason, as Matt said. But I began my career at Columbus State University in Georgia, which is a small regional comprehensive university, part of a state system. And we have they had a very diverse body of students. Also, many non-traditional students. Fort Benning is in Columbus, Georgia. It's the largest Army training site in the country, and so we had a lot of veteran and active duty military students as well. And my experience teaching there really shaped the way I see the power of education and the effect that great teaching can have on students. What I saw there was that effective teaching really changed lives, and that inspired me after I got tenure to say, what I want to try to do is to scale that, to try and do what I can to help every student in the country have a similar educational experience, because it really does matter. So as I moved into the teaching and learning world, I started to I started to have questions. The questions were not what works, because we have a ton of information about what teaching strategies work. And in fact, I would say by now we have kind of a canon of evidence-based teaching practices. So it wasn't so much what worked, it's why do some things work well and others not work so well. And every time I would ask that question, I would run up against a brick wall. And eventually it led me to the science of learning. And so today, really what we're interested in is thinking about how principles rooted in science can help us be more effective teachers and design better programs in higher education. I just want to say at the outset, though, that in no way does this mean that I think that science is the only way to approach great teaching. I also happen to feel, as someone in the humanities, that teaching is a great art as well. It's a creative act. And so, that would be a separate talk. But what I wanted to really address today is science. So as I was searching for answers to that question, how do we know what works and why? Why do some things work and others not work so well? What I found was I kept running into the same areas of the science of learning over and over again. In fact, when people would ask me, what are you working on now? And I would say something connected to the science of learning, they would always say, oh, you mean like Make It Stick. Has anyone read Make It Stick, by the way? I can't really see hands, but I'm assuming there might be a couple out there. This is a really good book. It's very popular, very well received, and has had a pretty big impact on how we think about teaching and learning in higher ed. The second and third authors there, Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel, those are two cognitive psychologists at the Washington University in St. Louis. They've built their entire career studying how people remember information and how you can draw that information back out when you need it. They're best known for things like retrieval practice and the testing effect and things like that. So the research in this book is spot on. The first author, and this is really interesting, Peter Brown is a novelist who they hired to make the book more readable. Now, I'm not sure what that says about academic writing, but what I will say is that it worked. The stories that he tells are really great. The other book here, that's by a journalist, covers much of the same ground, also really popular. The issue that I have is not with the research. I think it is important. Students do have to remember information, and they do have to be able to call that information out and apply it when needed. But I don't think that that's the end of the story. Remembering something is only one part of the much bigger story about learning. And so what I wanted to know was, so they remember things. How do they do things with it? How do they find their passions? How do they learn in such a way that they will use it throughout their lives? So that led me to a variety of disciplines. Beyond cognitive psychology, what I found was information in developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary biology, anthropology, that have been studying learning for a very long time. But because of the way academia is, we're not talking to each other very often. And so I saw what I was interested in is synthesizing a lot of that work into a more cohesive story about how we learn and how we can use that information. We can use that science as teachers to improve what happens in the classroom so that our students can learn more effectively. It led me through that 5-year adventure to eventually this book. And while I was doing that research, I kept finding, I was sort of struggling to find an organizational scheme into which to fit all of this information that I was finding. And it wasn't until a good friend and colleague gave me this book that it really clicked with me. This is a great book, The Scientists in the Crib. Those are 3 really well-known developmental psychologists. And I read this, and suddenly everything fell into place for me. Scientists are such successful learners because they're using cognitive abilities that evolution designed for the use of children. Now, I just want you to think about that for a second. They're not saying children can make scientific discoveries. That's something we've known for quite a long time, actually. Children use a rudimentary form of the scientific method all the time. What they're saying is that scientists can do what they do because they're using infrastructure that was designed for children to learn about the world. And suddenly, that book helped me tie everything together. That the story of human learning is a very long one. It goes back to our evolutionary past. It connects through our development as children and extends into the way we learn as adults. That the moral of the story, the kind of fundamental premise underlying all the research, is that we don't really change very much as learners throughout our lives. The ways we learn have not varied very much at all. They have been consistent from the very dawn of our species through how children understand the world and to the students who we work with in college classrooms. Our brains mature and the contexts change, but the mechanisms that we use to learn really stay the same. And that's kind of the premise of what I want to talk about today. As I was looking then, as I was pulling everything together, these 5 themes kept coming up over and over and over again. as to the fundamental ways that human beings learn most. So I'm going to just talk about them kind of briefly, and then end the talk today by looking at why does it all matter? What does knowing this information, how does it affect our work in higher education, and how can it perhaps change the way we do things in our colleges and universities? So I'm going to start with curiosity. I'll explain why in a little bit. Okay, take a second, and I just want you to think, what is your definition of the word curiosity? If you were forced at this moment, which I guess I kind of am doing, to define curiosity, how would you define it? Take a second to think about that, and then talk to the person next to you about what your definition is. Go for it. All right. Okay, so how many people have a definition that looks something like this? Where'd you go? It just worked. Maybe I'm out of range. There. Oops. How many people have something that looks like this? A biological drive caused by a state of arousal. Anyone have a definition that looks like that? Probably not. No one ever has their hand up for this one. That is a definition from the biologists. These are the biologists who study curiosity. And that first definition comes from a book by Dan Berline, who's one of the first biologists to really think seriously about curiosity as a biological construct, as a biological mechanism. So what they mean here is that curiosity is like many things, many states of arousal in human life. Let's take hunger as an example, right? We get hungry, that is the state of arousal. The hunger does not go away until we eat something. What the biologists are saying is that curiosity is exactly like that. We need to know something, we get into that state of arousal, and it does not go away until we find out the information that we need to know. Now, your definition may not look like that, but if you have ever had the experience where you have a question and you feel like you have a burning need to know that information and you can't go to sleep until you find out what the answer to that question is, you have experienced this. And that is what the biologists are saying, that it drives our need to understand new material. It drives our need to understand the world and to make sense of it. Okay, how about this? Anyone have a definition that looks similar to this? Information gap, the distance between what one knows and what one wants to know? Maybe? A couple more? These are the psychologists. And of course, psychologists have been studying curiosity longer than anyone else. George Lowenstein is one of the foremost psychologists to study curiosity, and this definition is considered by many to be the standard definition of curiosity, an information gap. Distance between what you know and what you want to know. Right? Now, he was also very clear that what he was trying to come up with was an operational definition of curiosity, which means able to be tested and measured in a lab setting. Right? He wanted to be able to measure it, and this was the way he came up with doing that. He was also pretty insistent that there were many other causes for curiosity, but this allowed him to measure it. So he acknowledged there was some biological underpinning to it as well, but this is what he was interested in. Anyone have this, right? A release of dopamine, followed by activity in the midbrain nucleus accumbens, and possibly the hippocampus. We're not sure about that. These are the cognitive neuroscientists, and they have more recently started to get interested in curiosity. And what they want to know is what is happening in our brains when we are curious about something. And as you may know, cognitive neuroscientists, in many ways, not in every case, but in many ways, seek to answer their questions by the use of what's called an fMRI, where their subjects will go into an MRI machine and they'll perform a cognitive task while the scientists are looking at the flow of blood in the brain. And the hypothesis is where the blood flows, that's the part of the brain or parts that are activated by that cognitive task. So they have the neuroscientists who are studying this question have been designing some really fun experiments that I just have to tell you about. Some of these experiments have asked the people in the fMRI trivia questions, just like you'd find in Trivial Pursuit or somewhere else. Now, can you imagine being stuck into an MRI and being asked trivia questions? That's the first thing. So they're asking them trivia questions, but they're also asking them to rate their confidence in their answer to the trivia question. So, yes, I think it's this, but I'm not really sure, or I'm 100% certain that that's the answer to it. And so what they noticed as they were studying it was when someone got an easy answer correct, there wasn't much to look at on the fMRI, not a lot going on. When someone, though, got an answer wrong that they expected to get correct, mass chaos. Mass chaos, like the brain is sending alarm signals out, something's wrong, and we have to know what's going on, right? And so that kind of connects up to those biological definitions, that when we need to know an answer that we have gotten incorrect or cannot find the answer, the brain is very active. It needs to seek that out. And part of that is because curiosity has been such a foundational element of human learning for a very, very long time. Good. This is my favorite one, though. It's important, but we don't understand it. Right? This is a very honest admission, I think, and I appreciate that. And I think you see some of this, right? I do think that we would understand it better, however, if we could get more people from different disciplines to talk to each other about what they're finding. Right? Okay. So, we are not the only curious species in the world. If you are a dog owner, you have seen that look often, in my case, right? So we are not the only curious species. Many other mammals they've shown some element of curiosity. By far, the most curious species, or at least the most attention that scientists have paid in terms of curiosity to other species, has been our primate cousins, the study of the curiosity in the apes. And many scientists have spent their whole careers looking at measuring curiosity in apes. In fact, one of the people I interviewed for the book, Kathleen Gibson, happened to be in Houston at the UT Dental School, of all places. I don't know how she found her way there, but she's an evolutionary biologist who's been studying the evolution of the brain and learning for a long time, and there she was at the dental school, right? But I found her, and we had lunch, and we talked, and so I asked her, how important was curiosity to the development of the way we learn? And this is someone who is so committed to her work that she actually lived with an ape in her house studying these questions, right? So she, more than anyone else, would know this. And she said, because it was there at the beginning, because it formed so much of the way we and those other species that are related to us understand the world, it must have played a huge role in the development of our learning processes in our brain, that curiosity lies underneath everything else in terms of how we learn now and how we have always learned in the past. I love that little guy. I don't know him, but he looks deeply curious about the world, right? And I have him up here because knowing that curiosity is such an important part of learning and studying it are two very different things. And the way folks have studied curiosity at play in the world has largely been to study children, especially young children, and the way they explore the world. So the developmental psychologists have had a lot to say and a lot of important information about how curious we are. And, this goes back a very long way, but the major kind of research thread that people have been looking at was the number of questions that children ask on a daily basis, right? If you've ever been around a 3-year-old for any length of time, you know that that number can be quite high sometimes, right? Why? What is this? Why is that happening, Daddy? So counting the number of questions that's something people have done for a long time. It goes back to Jean Piaget, a very important developmental psychologist, also known because he studied his children in his experiments, right? You can imagine all the conflict of interest questions that brings up. But he studied his children. From there, people have taken it in different directions. I'm highlighting a particular psychologist, Michelle Chouinard, because in 2007, she put out this amazing report, I think, that really changes the way we understand curiosity as it relates to learning. And what she was interested in is not just the number of questions, but the types of questions. And she studied a large number of children from infancy to age 5. And there's an important reason to stop at age 5, right? She studied infancy to age 5. You may be thinking right now, how do babies ask questions? They can't talk yet. But babies, even if they cannot talk, they engage in what she calls questioning behaviors. They point at something, they look at something, they suck. That's a typical infant response to being curious about something. So she was interested in this whole gamut. What she found over and over again, every single time, was that children would ask a what question followed by a why question, a fact-finding question followed by an application question. The pattern played out over and over and over again, right? All we had to do was to pay attention to it, right? And so here's why I think that's so important. There has been lots of ink spilled in lots of books in higher education about inquiry-based learning and how do we get students to ask the right kinds of questions. How on earth, for example, do we get students to ask what questions followed by why questions? And it turns out that we have known how to do that our entire lives. That what we need to do as teachers is not actually teach students how to do that. They know how to do that. What we have to do is create environments, create learning environments that allow them to utilize those skills, to access them and put them into practice. That's part of our role in drawing out this curiosity again. Good. I mentioned that age 5 is an important stopping point for developmental psychologists in terms of question asking, because then something happens to children, at least many children in the United States. They go to school, right? And so the question that others have been interested in, where does it go? If curiosity shapes every waking moment of a young child's life, what happens to it, right? What happens to it? And so this is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it, The Hungry Mind by Susan Engel. She works with future teachers at her college. And what she did was she went into the same school, several kindergarten classes and several 5th grade classes over the course of an academic year. And what she wanted to measure were instances of curiosity. It could be a question, it could be looking at something, it could be reading something of interest. What she found, sadly, was that there were not many instances of curiosity across the board. As you might intuit, there were more in kindergarten than there were in 5th grade, but not many across the board. The saddest thing I think she found was that in some of those 5th grade classes, she never witnessed a single instance of curiosity, right? So, little children, curiosity shapes their world. Some 5th grade classrooms, she sees none at all. Right? So something must happen at some point to that curiosity. And there are lots of things. If we had more time, I'd just ask you what your thoughts on what that might be, because there are lots of reasons why that might be true, right? Susan Engel points to the people in a child's life and the environments in which they exist that shapes curiosity. But I think what we take away from this is not that curiosity disappears. I think this is really important. I hear the question a lot, how do we get students to be more curious? That's not the right question. They are, but what we need to do is draw it back. because they have just had about 12 years of conditioning in educational environments where curiosity wasn't necessarily put on the pedestal as something to strive for. So we need to design activities and assignments and courses that will help them draw it back out for us and for them. Good. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A and the events over the next 2 days as well. Sociality. Okay. Talk briefly about this. By sociality, what I mean is our social natures as human beings. Biologists have shown that human beings are among the most social species on the planet. We're in fact in a very special category called eusociality, EU. We're joined there by about 19 species of ants and naked mole rats. It's very elite company that we're in that category. And those species who are in that category are there because not only do we operate as individuals, but we operate as groups. We think as individuals, we think as groups. What we do, every moment of our daily lives is shaped by both of those interactions, the individual and the group. So this is a central part of who we are. There's been some research to show what happens when humans are isolated from other people. It's not just psychological effects, but negative physical effects as well. People get sick when they're isolated from other people, which tells us, of course, that it's not just nice to be around people, but we actually need other people. And that is true for our learning as well, that the degree to which we can draw on this sociality in our learning environments will actually help to maximize the work that our students can do in the classrooms. That's tricky, though, and that's not always easy to achieve. Let's look at this. These folks seem like they're working on the group project, right? They seem super engaged. Everyone's deeply invested in the work that's happening there. Look at this guy leaning over. He's he's very curious about what's happening. What I would offer to you is that this might be the Platonic ideal of a group project, but this is not what they often look like. And I'm as guilty of this as any, but I think, what a lot of the ways that we try to draw on sociality, discussion-based teaching and group projects, often are really just individualized strategies dressed in sheep's clothing. So group projects, for example, what often happens is we hope that this is what we get. What often happens, though, is that students will say, I'm going to do part A, you do part B, you do part C. We're going to come back together right before the presentation, and we'll go from there, right? Now, it might be interesting product, but that's not drawing on people's sociality to really learn, right? The same is true of discussions. Discussions have the opportunity to be our most effective social pedagogies. Some discussions do that. They achieve that. Collectively, as groups, students and faculty build knowledge together. Some discussions are what I call lectures in sheep's clothing. They do this. What's the name of the guy who wore the red shirt on page 42? Bob. Moving on, right? There's sort of fact-finding missions that between one faculty and a student, right? They don't really, again, draw on our interactions with other people. So how do we do it then? Well, anything that we can create where students have to work together in order to develop the knowledge or get the answer. So they each might have a piece of it and need to work together to weave those pieces together. There might be an assignment with a big question in the field, questions that I might not even know the answer to, but in working together, they take steps to address that question or develop a piece of an answer to that question. Those are the kinds of strategies that get us to here, that get us to ways to utilize those social bonds, those social connections to really enhance learning. Okay, emotion. This is my favorite part to work on. And part of the reason it was my favorite is because we're not that great about talking about emotions in higher education. In fact, as soon as the subject comes up, people start squirming in their seats and say, well, I don't want to be touchy-feely and, I have to maintain the authority of the classroom, which is, then I don't dispute that part, right? And sometimes, though, I hear, well, if I start worrying about people's emotions, how on earth will I maintain the rigor of my class? The rigor, it's always about the rigor. I have a friend named Kevin Gandon who has a great book coming out. Part of it says rigorous for corpses. So his point is, yeah, okay, we could talk about that, but that doesn't get us very far. And in fact, here's what I want to leave you with about academic rigor. What the literature and research on emotions and teaching shows us is that if students believe that you care about them as human beings and as learners, they will go further than you ever thought possible. They will attack the big questions. They will embrace whatever rigor you're building into your courses because you are invested in them, and in turn, they are invested in you. So, for a long time, people tried very, very hard to show that thinking and feeling were separate. Over the last few decades, though, what we've learned is that they work hand in hand. And in fact, the way I describe it in the book is that they follow the same choreography. Dancers, partners following the same choreography. One primes the other, and to the degree that we can enhance a student's positive emotions in the classroom, they will learn more. That's what this research is showing. Positive emotion, happiness, enthusiasm, engagement, laughing, having a good time. None of those are antithetical to learning. In fact, they enhance the learning that's happening. And there are easy ways to do that. I'll give you two very, very easy ways to prime a student's positive emotions. One is calling on them by name, right? This is one of the things the research shows is the absolute foundation for establishing this emotional connection in the classroom, that when you refer to a student by name, they feel a part of the community, they feel invested in the work. It's easier, of course, to memorize names in smaller classes, but even if you teach large classes, the trick that we often share with folks is to use name tense, so that students can write their names and you can call them by name, even if you haven't been able to remember it yet, right? It's not the memorization that leads to the effect. It's the use of the name that matters. Another really simple way, students respond, and in fact, it's contagious in many ways, to our enthusiasm in the classroom. Now, that's not saying that you have to be someone who you're not, do jumping jacks and things like that on stage. What it means is showing them why we're passionate about our material and our disciplines, why we're engaged with the work we're doing in the courses. That really matters, and students pick up on that. Those are two just basic ways to do it. There's lots more as well. But the research is clear, priming a student's positive emotions matters a lot for learning. There's another side to this coin, though, that I want to just emphasize quickly. And this is an editorial by George Will in the Washington Post from last year, I think, 2018. In it, he trots out every tired stereotype from this particular line of discourse that you could possibly find in an editorial. Microaggressions, eggshell, unintellectual. In it, you'll find things about trigger warnings and safe spaces. So everything a commentator who believes in these things could say, he does say about students in this editorial. Here's one thing that I think is very, very important to understand. The other side of the emotion coin is this. When the student is experiencing an emotional response that supersedes his or her ability to regulate that response, the cognitive functions shut down, right? Emotional response that you can't regulate, the cognitive functions shut down. Now, there are very good biological reasons for that to happen, right? But let me talk about the effect of that. There is nothing you can do as a teacher in a classroom if a student is having that kind of response to help them learn. The emotional response has to wane before he or she can learn again. Now, it doesn't have to be negative emotion, though we usually talk about the negative emotions in this respect. But honestly, if a student just found out she got into med school before she came into a class, it's going to be hard to learn in that case as well, right? But here's what I want to say. So what George Will and people who write like George Will don't understand is that the research on emotions, and specifically this research on emotion, shows that students do not call for things like this, trigger warnings and safe spaces, because they want to avoid difficult subjects. That's what George Will believes, and he's wrong. Because the research shows that something like a trigger warning, giving a heads up about a difficult scene in a novel, for example, is what I would call very, very poetically a pre-regulatory device. Right? In fact, if we just switch the conversation and call them pre-regulatory devices, we shut down the debate. Who wants to argue against pre-regulatory devices, right? But that's what a trigger warning is. It doesn't allow someone to escape talking about it. It gives someone the tools to regulate the emotions in advance so that he or she can participate in the discussion. It's a very important tool, and it's connected directly to the research on emotions and learning. A couple more, then we'll get to the effects. Authenticity. I'm using this term the way most of the research that I was reading uses this term, and this is in the sense of cognitive authenticity or cognitive realism. And what we mean by that, the brain's ability to immediately detect an authentic learning environment from an artificial learning environment, right? An authentic learning environment meaning that you are doing things, you are learning things, and then immediately applying them in a similar context as you would use them out in the real world or in a real circumstance, right? An artificial learning environment are those environments where you're sitting there, and I hope none of you fall into this camp right now, where you're thinking, why do I possibly need to know this information? I'm never, ever going to use this ever again, right? That's an artificial learning environment. And the brain picks up on it immediately, and if it detects an artificial learning environment, it goes on vacation, starts allocating the resources elsewhere, right? Because it's a very pragmatic organ. So do I need it? Is it necessary for me? Nope, I'm out of here. Right? And so what we need to think about, how do we invest our learning environments with more authenticity? So I have two examples up here, flying an airplane and being in a flight simulator. What this research says is that both are authentic activities. Now, one has obviously much more opportunity for cost and loss of life and things like that. But they're both authentic activities. You are utilizing information, applying them in the context that they would normally be applied. What the literature says also is that although those are both authentic activities, hearing a lecture about how to fly an airplane would not be an authentic activity, right? Strictly based on this research. Now, that is not, and I want to be clear about this, not poo-pooing the lecture in any way, right? Lectures have a place, a tool. They can be a tool in the toolbox as useful as many other strategies. What the research, and as you know, I'm sure, there's heated debates all the time. Active learning versus lecturing, active learning versus lecturing. And really, the only thing that the research on lecturing shows, two things. One is, it's okay to lecture. Students need to know things, right? And we are in a position to help them know things. But the second thing, it's okay to lecture, but not for too long. That is what the research ultimately shows, right? And so it's only once we cross a certain threshold where lots of other factors, attention span, authenticity, come into play with how much a student can actually learn in a lecture-based environment. So that's really important, I think, to keep in mind. Those are the only two things that lecture-based learning actually has shown us. Okay, failure. I'm going to talk a lot about failure in my workshop tomorrow, so I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview of what we learned from this. I like to end on optimistic notes. Failure is an optimistic subject, right? So this is not something we're great about talking about in higher ed, but what I would encourage you to think about is how you have learned something in your life, something you're good at, something that you're proud of, and I would encourage you to think about how you learned that. And in many cases, it was probably trying something out, getting it wrong, getting feedback on it, trying it again, doing it again, getting more feedback, a constant cycle, right? We know this. We're scholars, we're teachers, we've experienced the learning process. We know that's how it works. But our educational systems are set up in exactly the opposite way, right? We don't give students that opportunity very often. In fact, what we typically do would be to give them one chance on a really high-stakes assignment, and we slap a grade on it, right? And that arrests that natural learning process that we're talking about. So a lot of folks are really looking carefully at ways to build low-stakes failure into our courses in a safe environment where students can get a lot of feedback, but don't necessarily need to worry at that moment about being evaluated on the product. I have this big brain up here. You're probably wondering why. Because I think what I've learned from this research on failure is that human beings make a lot of mistakes all the time. And it's a feature and not a bug. We're actually built to make those mistakes and to figure them out. We have signal processors in our brain. The ERN is the error-related negativity, and PE is error positivity. They are constantly detecting all the time, right, wrong, right, wrong, right, wrong. When they get to a wrong answer, alarm bells go off, and they draw resources to figuring out what went wrong. So to set up an educational system where we stigmatize mistakes and errors and say to students, getting something wrong is bad, goes against the way we are built. That is not how we learn, right? But we have designed systems, and these systems have been around for a long time, where this is what students see when they think of failure. And so the ways that we can, and there are many opportunities, but the ways that we can utilize failure, error, and mistakes as learning opportunities rather than penalties, the degree that we can, to which we can do that, we will help our students to learn more effectively. Going to end just by talking about why it all matters. So we know this. What does it matter, right? Beyond our classroom, why should we really be concerned about this? Well, first of all, I think this is really important. It inoculates us against edufads. The more you know about the science of learning, the more resistant we can be to the constant new ideas that are always coming down the pike. I don't know about here, but the campuses I've been, I've seen what folks call initiative fatigue, constant new ideas all the time, right? And I say, the more we know about this, the easier it is to say, look, I know how people learn. That's not going to work. It's just not going to work, right? If you hopped in a time machine and went way back to the year 2012, you would see two things that higher ed press was talking about, MOOCs and flipped classrooms, right? MOOCs, massive open online courses, hundreds of thousands of students, infinitesimal completion rates, right? We now know. But if we used the science of learning in those debates, we would have easily seen what would happen with that model, right? Lots of people not talking to each other, no contact with the professor, doing rote kind of memorization sorts of things. Although people have experienced subsequent success with it, that model just doesn't work. It doesn't work based on what we know. Flipped learning, a little bit different, utilizing out-of-class time to learn more effectively so that you can work together in groups and with the instructor in class time. That has more potential, right? I can look at the science of learning and say, that makes sense. It allows us to test our intuitions and assumptions. I have a lot of assumptions and gut feelings about what I think work with my students. Science of learning helps us test those intuitions like any good researchers, right? I think this works. Let me see if it works, right? Let me see if the research backs it. Helps us to build stronger, more cohesive student success programs. I highlight this because a trend that I've seen both in writing about higher ed and in many campuses I've visited is that many of our campuses have student success initiatives, and people are doing great work on those. But the trend that I've noticed is that teaching and learning often gets left out of that conversation, which to me is strange because the classroom is the front lines of student success. And so bringing the science of learning to bear on those initiatives can only help us help our students to succeed. And finally, serves as a litmus test for developing new pedagogies. And I think this is crucial. I think that We can refine what we are currently doing in the classroom, but more important, we can develop new strategies rooted in these principles that will not only help our students now, but the students we will have 20 years from now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Come join me for a few questions.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Josh.
you.
This has been a special opportunity for us to collect a body of people and talk about teaching. I love what you said. You know, sometimes it's hard for everybody to stay on the same page, and we're not talking about it. So thank you for the opportunity to kind of share that.
Well, I appreciate the time here, definitely.
I would love to get into a couple of the topics that you talked about. I know that the emotion component is something you feel very, very, very strong about, and you probably get this question a lot. People saying, well, yes, I mean, we certainly get into teaching because we care about our students. We want to care about them all the time. But aren't we coddling them if we're only concerned about, or if we make that happiness and that all of that the main center, right, in the context of a bit of the fragility that I think some people, as you mentioned in the one article very strongly, but in the context of the fragility that I think some people do see. How do you respond to the people who kind of push back a little bit more on that topic?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it's not coddling, I don't think, to simply convey to students that you are invested in who they are and what they're learning, and which is ultimately kind of the backbone of this research. And I would say that everything that I have read and looked at in the course of working on this project really emphasizes that it does not in any way detract from the work or fall into a definition of coddling. It enhances the work that you can do with students. And I think many of us have probably had the experience where we have been in a classroom with a teacher who obviously cared and wanted their students to succeed. And that is just a very different experience. And students will often say, yeah, I'll do whatever he or she wants me to do, right? I'll do whatever they ask because of that, I think, emotional component. So I do think, there are many, many, many ways to plug into this dynamic that fit your own teaching persona and who you are in the classroom. And you can do it while maintaining a sense of, without breaking the fourth wall or breaking the invisible wall, I think, because you don't have to be friends with students. I want to be really clear. That's not what this says. It's not about being friends with students. It's showing them that you care about their learning.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. I think it's something that comes up in
Definitely.
that thread quite a bit.
Yes.
You just mentioned teaching persona, and I was curious if you could speak a little bit to that. We have teachers of all different age groups in the room, a lot of college, but I think some high school and some aspiring teachers as well. Can you talk about the evolution of a teaching persona, or perhaps how people can develop one, or if people are looking to expand their own teaching persona? Do you have anything to say about that?
Sure, yes. Okay, so by teaching persona, we simply mean who you are in front of the classroom, right? And that's probably not who you are with your family and not who you are with your friends. And so a teaching persona, the person that you are, the teacher you are, the self that you cultivate in front of your students and in working. It's really just a professional identity in many ways, right? But I think there's some great work on that. Bell Hooks has written about it. Parker Palmer has written about it. Lots of amazing writers have written about the teaching persona. They all agree on one thing, that it should be authentic to who you are. Don't necessarily try to put on the persona of your favorite teacher if it doesn't fit who you are, right? Don't tell jokes if that's not who you are, right? It should really feel authentic. To the point of evolution, I think it really does develop over the course of a career. I think depending on who you are, there are lots of different dynamics in play about how you see yourself in front of a classroom and maintain a sense of professional working relationship with your students. And so lots of considerations in in how you go about that.
Can you think of any exercises, or is it primarily, do you find a reflection kind of thing if you're looking into exploring this?
I think there actually those who I've read some really great things from professors of acting. And thinking about as a role, it is true that teaching. I don't call it personally a performance, but I think there's something performative about it, right? And so I've found some great things from acting teachers. Also, really important considerations of race and identity and gender, and thinking about all those things as they relate to the self that you put out in a classroom.
Cool. From the performer that I am, I love hearing, because I do think of it as a performance in a way. It's a kind of performance, and the creative component as well. We got into a bit of a discussion in the green room about the accountability component.
Right.
And I think that that's something that, particularly at the college level, we maybe run across perhaps a bit more than some of the younger, but maybe not. That idea that we're putting it all out there, but then we still don't have, sometimes there's students who aren't coming to the table with any, meeting us halfway. So, and you were talking about the importance of the accountability part of it. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, and I really do think that's a great question. I think that those of us who work in teaching and learning circles talk a lot about what we could be doing better in the classroom. And I think that what gets lost in that discussion is that this is a two-way street, of course. And as especially traditional age students in college are also learning, they're transitioning from one developmental stage to another as well. They're becoming adults, and they're learning how to become adults. And so they're making decisions about prioritization and about accountability as well. And so it is true that we could do every single thing that the literature recommends on effective teaching, and if the accountability is not there, then it's hard to make it happen, right? Now, there may be some reasons, right, that why students might be missing class or something like that, and we need to look into those. But beyond that, it really is, it's a dynamic that has to have both parties invested in the work.
Right. Thank you. When you have come across, and in your research, do you have, and we were talking about tips and secrets and these kinds of things, and I know there are lots in the book. I was wondering if you might share from your research for this book a favorite sort of tactic or tip that you run across. One thing, and we will be on the radio later, we can talk about things more, but I noticed that your syllabi in particular are very conversational. They really sort of open a conversation rather than just list things. And I was curious if that would be a favorite tactic or tip, or are there other things that really stand out?
It's related to that, actually. The biggest thing that I've come across that I think that I try to tell as many people about as possible, because I think it's the best tip that I currently know. And that is one way to address some of the frustrations with technology in the classroom, with some of the same sorts of things that you were just talking about with accountability. One thing that people are experimenting with that has had a ton of success is working on the first and second day of the semester, even just the first day, to develop with students a classroom compact for those things together. So you are working together to talk to them about what has helped you learn in the past, what has been an obstacle to learning in the past, and that opens the technology door. And in every case that I've seen this, students will be very honest and say, it really distracts me when people are on their phones in class. And so together, you are making that compact. The result of that is that everyone's invested in it. And very often, the social pressures of that will have students policing themselves. So it's no longer, I am the rule maker and you are the rule breaker. Now it's, here's what we agreed on as a community, and you're going against the norms that we established. And so that's the biggest thing I'm starting to see in lots of different pockets of higher ed.
Cool, thank you for that, Jem. I have one last question, which is a sort of a playful approach, because I want to let everyone know that we do have books available for sale, and Josh would be here to sign them. One of the sort of strong statements in the book is about grades.
Okay.
And so we'll just sort of tease it a bit, and maybe
Right.
you can say just a tad about that. But I think that you say you wouldn't mind if grades went away completely.
Right.
Would you care to comment on that?
I would, and it's nice of you to bring that up. The current project I'm working on is all about this, all about grades. And so if you look at kind of that literature on failure and the kind of broad swath of information out there about learning, what we know for absolutely certain is that what helps people learn is feedback, not evaluation. Now, we are in the midst of a 200-year-old system of evaluating people's work, right? And so that's a hard system to undo. So people are trying to play around with ways within the system of giving grades to de-emphasize the role of grades in favor of feedback. And there are all kinds of models for that we could talk about. In a perfect world, the teaching and learning relationship really would be a constant process of looking at work and giving feedback on it, not necessarily evaluating. Now, part of the feedback is saying, well, you're on the wrong track here, try this, right? But that's different from saying C-,
right?
Which conveys a very clear message psychologically to students. The reason I'm so passionate about it right now is because the CDC and the Pew Research Institute separately have just put out major studies that show a direct linkage between the mental health crisis with preteens and teenagers to academic stress. Not a correlation, a causation, right, as one of the factors that have contributed to that.
Oh, wow.
And so the degree that we can kind of break that hold, we're helping them not just learn, but be more healthy as well. And so I think that that's something that we have to partner. It's not just a college thing. It's education as a whole.
Right. So it sounds like another book might be in the works?
Yeah, working on it now. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, great. Do you know when it might be?
I don't yet. Yeah, it's still
Okay.
the early days, but it's really interesting to work on.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time with me on stage, and thank you again for being here. A conversation can continue now, right outside if you're interested in books, and we'll also be on the radio on KSUU Thunder 91.1 at 3 p.m. today. So on behalf of everyone here and our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, thank you so much, Josh, for your time today.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.